And I think, like many, I find myself despairing about our country's division, and that's a divide that seemingly continues to expand, seems to become exacerbated daily. And that trajectory feels like it's in lockstep with this breakdown in our ability to effectively communicate in a healthy way, which is amplified by this growing distrust in our institutions and a decline in the trust that we've placed in our media landscape to deliver the news and information objectively. And there doesn't seem to be a shortage of people who understand this problem or notice it or recognize it. Fewer, though, seem to offer solutions, even fewer creative solutions, and only a very few who demonstrate any kind of good faith willingness to actually tackle the problem and do something about it. But I do see all of that in you, which is one of the reasons why I'm excited to talk to you. And you do it with, kind of this beautiful, genuine nature, and with the sensibility that you're coming to the table in good faith with these original and bold ideas, and this optimism around the untapped potential of our democratic experiments.
I couldn't agree more that people feel very pessimistic because polarization is getting worse and worse. You see that more and more Americans regard their political opponents as their enemies. Mm-hmm. I'm a numbers guy, so 42% of both Republicans and Democrats consider the other side either evil or their mortal enemies. And we can all feel that anger rising. It may well result in political violence. It already has, really, over the next number of years. And I want to suggest that your podcast, your voice, is one of the antidotes. One of my premises of the future is that people don't trust institutions anymore. They trust other people, like people that have been following your journey and listen to your advice and guidance and experiences, have a sense of who you are, what makes you tick. And that's what we need right now. We need to bring people around to trust each other again. It starts with trusting individuals like yourself. I think that independent media like podcasts is actually something that we can build on to try to rebuild trust.
Yeah, I mean, what's so interesting about your path is that in many ways, you were and are the podcast candidate. I mean, you were somebody who was not getting recognized appropriately in legacy media. And then you go on Sam Harris, you go on Joe Rogan, and all the subsequent appearances that you've made on a variety of podcasts, not the least of which being Crystal and Sagar. And that really advanced not only your profile, but the policy measures that you care so deeply about. And it triggered this national conversation. As somebody, thank you for those kind words, but as somebody who is a podcaster, that's really fascinating just forensically to observe that, in contrast to the way that legacy media has always operated. And it gives me hope, and I think you're correct, in that there is a need and an appetite for long-form conversations. When you sit down with somebody and you talk to them for hours, and it's a relatively agenda-free scenario, that allows people to get a real feel and sense of who you are and where you're coming from, as opposed to this clickbaity soundbite, yell for 5 seconds on cable news ecosystem that we've grown so accustomed to.
Yeah, it's more like how human beings interact in real life. You sit with someone and you have a conversation. I certainly have done more than my fair share of 5-minute long cable news hits.
Yeah.
And one of the things I say to my team is that after a cable news hit, I'd be like, any data? Anyone go to the website? Anyone donate? And the answer was always no.
Yeah.
And so I started saying, then why am I doing these things? And the answer that I got was legitimacy, was that if you do a cable news hit, it actually sends a signal to voters that they're allowed to consider you, because there's a very, very significant number of voters who rely upon the media for that framing. And that's particularly true among Democrats. You probably saw I recently left the Democratic Party, so now I'm independent.
I noticed.
But Democrats believe in the news media to a much higher degree than anyone else. The numbers are 69% of Democrats have high trust in media. For independents, it's only 36%. And for Republicans, it's a whopping 15%. So this is maybe one of the defining elements of the parties at this point. But I was running in a Democratic primary. so having the blessing, even the tacit blessing of the cable news networks was important.
Yeah. Well, one of the more fascinating aspects of your book, which I enjoyed very much, is just your characterization of what that media complex is like from a boots on the ground experience, from the perspective of you during the campaign. And it's very dispiriting to see how political media, the political media industrial complex actually operates in kind of cahoots with the political parties to advance certain narratives and mute other ones. And, you know, it's really, yes, there are podcasts, but can we see a way forward to, you know, kind of transcend this quagmire that is keeping us stuck in a certain status quo that, you know, by all accounts, and certainly, you know, by virtue of what you talk about, is not functioning?
Yeah, that's one of the main reasons I wanted to write this book, Rich. I came off the trail, and I will confess to everyone that I did approximately zero reflection when I was running for president.
How could you? It's just what's in front of you to do immediately next.
Yeah, I was like a hammer where it's like, what's the nail? And like, you know, just do. And then when the day ends, you just kind of, you know, crawl into bed. Right. I wasn't like, oh, I'm going to take notes for a book. But I wanted to catalog the journey for people because I had learned so much going into the bowels of our media industrial complex and our political industrial complex. And the media's incentives are very, very distorting as to which candidates they will suppress and which they will amplify. I'm not the only candidate who is on the outside looking in. I mean, I think we all remember in 2016, Bernie versus Hillary, where they would be kneecapping Bernie at every turn. And the news media and the DNC were very much hand in glove. You know, there's a different set of issues on the other side. But being subject to that did make me very hungry to try and find alternatives. And it is one reason why I'm very confident in my new path, is that the Democrats will be like the last of the institutionalists. Even as more and more people say, wait, this isn't working. Like the Democratic primary voters in particular are going to be the last people saying, hang on, it is working, even when most of us have lost faith. Well, again, it is because of their trust in the news media, and the news media will be hammering certain messages until the last dog dies, essentially. There's an institutional mindset and a trust that many Democrats naturally have to a higher degree. If you were to summarize where the parties are right now, the Democrats are the people who are hanging on to the fading and fumbling institutions. And then Republicans have been overtaken with this anti-institutional fervor embodied by Donald Trump. And what I'm going to suggest is that a lot of us are not on either of those sides. The Forward Party, which I founded, now is trying to call attention to the real defects and issues our institutions have, in the hopes that we can rejuvenate them, reform them, build new ones. That's the kind of positive stance that a lot of us wish existed in our politics, as opposed to the two poles, which are just going to end up more and more extreme over time.
Yeah. I want to get into all the Forward Party stuff. But before we do that, I mean, you mentioned this built-in inherent trust that the Democratic Party has in institutions versus the mindset of Republicans. And that harkens to the work of Jonathan Haidt, who looms large in your book. You cite him frequently. And his studies are quite fascinating in terms of the psychological differences between Democrats and Republicans. So can you elucidate that a little bit?
Yeah, Jonathan is such an incredible philosopher, really. He's a friend as well. And his work on the righteous mind, how Americans can disagree on politics while still being good people, I think is one of the most important works of our time. So he makes the case that there are 6 universal values in human culture that transcend national borders. They are caring, fairness, liberty, loyalty, authority, and sanctity. And it turns out that Democrats and Republicans respond to different values on that list. Democrats tend to respond more to caring and fairness, and Republicans tend to respond more to loyalty, authority, and sanctity. And then the two sides define liberty differently. And so what you see is you have news media organizations that really hammer different themes that strike that chord with their audience. It's one reason why the media organizations now don't seem very objective. They become increasingly companies that profit from separating us into institutional camps. And they've figured out what Jonathan wrote about, which is that if you hammer certain notes or values or symbols, then you can command much more loyalty and affection. One of the main lessons I have here is that all politics is tribal. We're not arguing over policies, really. We're arguing over team colors. It's one reason why things are going to become so disastrous. And so what you need to do is you need to try to introduce a different dynamic of tribalism. One thing I'm going to suggest is you would need more than 2 tribes because the last thing you want to do is have 2 great warring tribes. But Jonathan Haidt's work did inform my prescription because he explains why it is that we can be so divided on multiple levels. Yeah.
On the one hand, it's dispiriting to hear that media companies would kind of grok that psychology and then weaponize it. On the other hand, for me, it allows me to have a deeper appreciation or level of empathy for people of different points of view to understand that they're just wired differently and they see the world differently. And it is a disposition that is constitutional rather than kind of the result of influence or environment.
Yeah, the single biggest concern we should have in this domain is the dehumanization of different people of different political beliefs. And Jonathan posits that a lot of this is actually genetic, where you're born with a particular psychological disposition of openness or sensitivity to threat or appetite for novelty, and that ends up pushing you in one direction or the other. So if someone voted for Trump or approves of a certain policy, it should have nothing to do with their value as a human being or their worth in that respect. But unfortunately, in this time, people regard folks who have different beliefs as somehow less worthwhile.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lack of respect for differentiation in beliefs and ideology. I mean, I grew up in Washington, D.C. I grew up in a kind of inside the Beltway situation throughout, the late 70s and early 80s. And my recollection of that was that there was a respect and a level of comedy between parties. You would go to dinner. My parents would have dinner parties, or
both sides.
I went to school with people that were, the offspring of politician X, Y, and Z, and these people lived in your neighborhood and in your community, and there were Republicans and Democrats, and irrespective of those differences, there was a respect that seems to have been completely lost. And I'm fascinated by what has catalyzed this, this divide. I mean, can it be all tracked to media? Like, is it this, increasing gap in wealth inequality? Like, how do you think about how we went from there to here?
One of the big lessons I've learned and I'm trying to convey to people is that if everyone follows their incentives in a reasonable way, we are sunk as a society. And you ask why it is that, and I also remember a time when it seemed like people of different parties got along as human beings, and now they see themselves in a different light. And the reason is incentives, where I was with a Republican senator a couple weeks ago, and she said that it serves political interest better if you keep an issue alive than if you resolve it. Because if you keep an issue alive, you can just get people mad about it and blame the other side and raise a lot of money. And then if you resolve it, someone on your side is going to be mad at you. And one example that I posed, she didn't pose this, but that came to mind for me, was when Senator Marco Rubio proposed bipartisan immigration reform a number of years ago. And then he pulled it back about a week later after getting absolutely hammered by his own party. but it was like a sign of, if you do lean forward to compromise, you're going to get attacked. So the political incentives end up driving people to their corners. And by the numbers, right now, Congress has a national approval rating of about 28%. It's quite low, probably doesn't surprise anyone listening to this. The re-election rate for individual members of Congress is 92%, which is sky high. I mean, that's like a better win rate than the 2016 Warriors or something like those lines. So you dig into that and say, how can this be that we can be so dissatisfied with Congress as a body, and yet our members always get reelected? And the mechanics are such that 83% of the districts in the country are either very blue or very red. So the game for me as a representative is not to serve 51% of the voters in my community. It's to please and placate the 10 to 20% most extreme partisan voters that are going to turn out in the primary. So my political incentives then are to be more extreme and ideological than the average person. And that's why the incentives are what you just described, which is you have political incentives that reward people for being more and more partisan. You have media organizations compounding those incentives. And then now you have social media pouring gasoline on the whole thing. And this is one reason why the polarization is at a point where we can literally see ourselves devolving into Civil War 2.0. And that sounds hyperbolic and negative, but a scholar named Peter Turchin has been measuring political stress, and he has us presently at Civil War levels.
That's terrifying.
Yeah, and if you reflect on it, we've already seen heretofore unthinkable scenes unfolding in the United States. And the question you have to ask yourself is that going to get more extreme or less extreme in the days to come? I'm going to suggest it's only going to get more extreme because that's where all the incentives are driving us.
Right. Meanwhile, just today, I'm sure you saw the announcement that Trump made around the this new social media platform that he's going to be launching, which, to my mind, I mean, I don't know what your perspective is on this, is only going to exacerbate that divide and further, inflame those perverse incentives.
I'm going to be fascinated to see how this unfolds. I am skeptical that he's capable of operating a true technological rival
his
to some of these
track record
platforms.
Isn't great on this, but we'll see, right?
But it is a sign of the times for sure. And it's fascinating how these tech companies have become essentially the arbiters of information and communication for everyone, like in a public commons manner. I'm friends with some of the folks at these tech companies. There are clear excesses on that side, but I think that the issues are not what Trump and the gang are proposing. Like those aren't the real problems. I mean, a lot of the problems are around our deteriorating mental health as a result of social media use, particularly among young people, particularly among teenage girls. And there are probably people that listen to this podcast who are parents who are concerned about it. The data shows that what the Facebook whistleblower, Frances Haugen, proposed, a lot of people I know in Silicon Valley already knew this. I'm sure the same is true for you.
Yeah. And as a parent of teenagers, I'm hyper aware of this. And this is a subject that's come up frequently on the podcast. And it's heartbreaking. And I think the solution remains to be seen. I mean, it's a very difficult problem to tackle.
I propose a couple solutions in the book, but one thing that I thought was common sense is just turn off Instagram between the hours of midnight and 8 a.m. Yeah. For your kid. If there's a minor, I mean, do they really need to be on Instagram during those hours? We should be able to take measures like that.
Yeah, it's tricky though. As somebody who has teenagers right now, it's a very difficult thing to actually put in place.
Well, you could go to the company level. I don't know. Yeah. If I were president, I would seriously be talking to folks and be like, look, what are common sense measures we could take? And of course, some people would hate them and some people would say you're being heavy-handed. But we have to look at the data. I mean, the data shows that this stuff's not great in overabundance.